A high-level Canadian government source is revealing to CBC News the events that led up to the death of Sergeant Andrew Joseph Doiron in northern Iraq on Friday evening. Here's what that source told us about the incident. Sergeant Doiron's team was 200 meters from the front lines in the village of Bashik, near the ISIS-held city of Mosul. The soldiers had been there earlier in the day and had prearranged a rendezvous with Kurdish troops. The official also disputes the Kurdish account that the team showed up unannounced, telling CBC News the Canadians arrived back at the rendezvous Friday evening and were acknowledged by two separate groups of Peshmerga fighters without incident. But a third group engaged them by opening fire, and that's when Sergeant Doiron was killed and three other soldiers injured with non-life-threatening injuries. Kurdish officials also say Canadian Special Forces troops spoke Arabic to them, which made them nervous, made them suspicious, and also that the Canadian ops team ignored orders to stay in their vehicle. Now, the incident has the Canadian government and Kurdish officials publicly at odds over exactly what led to the death of Sergeant Doiron, although the Canadian team, the chief of the defense staff, saying he doesn't want this to wreck the professional relationship or the friendship between the two sides, that will continue on, and called the statements of the Kurds awkward. I'm going to bring in now, to help us dig through these conflicting accounts and dig deeper into the questions of Sergeant Doiron's death for Canada's mission in Iraq, is Scott Taylor. He's a former infantryman in the Canadian Forces and the editor and publisher of Esprit de Corps military magazine. Scott has spent a lot of time in Iraq, 21 trips, as I understand it, Scott. There may have been more since the last time we chatted, 21. And you were actually kidnapped in this region back in 2006, so you know it well. I also want to tell you something else that's just coming across the wires now, that include our audience on this as well. Baz News, this is reported in the Globe and Mail just moments ago. A Kurdistan media outlet based in Erbil, Iraq, is quoting Peshmerga commander Mozagardi as saying, and this is from the Globe and Mail, that the intervention of the driver of the Canadian team convinced the Kurds to stop firing on Special Forces troops from Canada, saying this situation could have been much worse if it wasn't for the driver. In the Globe and Mail report, it says the Kurds says the Canadians initially approached one of their checkpoints in a car, left their vehicle. Commander Gardi told Baz News if it wasn't for the Canadian driver, all three may have been shot. The Canadian's driver, not the Canadian driver. All three may have been shot dead in the melee. It was this man who convinced the Peshmerga that they were attacking Canadian advisors and not Islamic State militants. So, Scott, there is the Kurdish Peshmerga, bound and determined, obviously not listening to whatever advice they're getting from Canadians to change their story or to come up with a different, more diplomatic statement, sticking to their story that it was the Canadian ops team's fault. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it may be awkward for the Chief of Defense Staff, but it's going to certainly cause a lot of bad blood on the ground for the Canadian Special Operations Regiment advisors that are there. It was their comrades that were wounded and killed, and to have these comments coming out and then playing this out in the media that it's the Canadians' fault, the victims in this friendly fire incident isn't going to sit well with them, that's for sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can say anything you want, but I mean, the fact is that it's these guys, they're not waiting for the investigation to take place, and I mean, we may never know the actual truth of what took place here, because we're going to get a he said, she said stuff from our survivors, and then, of course, from what we're already hearing from the Kurds. Okay.
The government, let's start here. The government says we are not in a combat position in Iraq. We're not on a combat mission. What do you say?
They've been dancing around this one for, I mean, since we first found out that our soldiers were under fire. That was a few weeks ago, that they were under sniper fire, they were under mortar fire. They were within range of the front lines, and we found out that they were laser targeting for airstrikes, which they would, specifically they had said they would not be doing. And then they turned around and I think the word was that the mission had evolved. And of course, they had never advised us of this, even though there's weekly technical briefings ever since October, that updating us as to which dump truck they've blown up or what target they've engaged. They never thought to mention the fact that this mission has evolved and we've now advanced to the front lines. They then realized that, of course, the Canadian public didn't react to that. In fact, we were on the front lines. We all know ISIS is evil, so we weren't that alarmed. We weren't taking casualties, and if our guys were taking the fight, it didn't resonate with the public, even though there was attempts to make political points from it. Now, again, we've got a dead body on our hands. We've got 3 guys wounded, and suddenly it's up the ante. But
is it a game changer?
I think it should be a debate intensifier. People should now, instead of looking at, are they on the front line? Is 200 meters behind the front line the front line? Of course it is. I mean, crew-served weapons engage out to 2,000 meters. You're not 200 meters back of a bunker. You're not off the front line. So there's all these semantics. And even we had the Chief of Defense Staff using the word accompany, that they were accompanying Kurdish troops and that it means something different in a military parlance. He was saying there's a definition, a military definition. I defy you to go on Google and find a military definition of accompany. I've never heard of it. I mean, certainly it made people sit up and go, what's he talking about?
If we could parse that for a second. So if somebody's saying they were accompanying troops, so they're only accompanying troops to the front line, and that's how the 20% of our people, I remember military spokesman saying back when 80% of it is back of the front line, but the 20% is going to have to accompany troops up to the front line. In this case, it was clear, I mean, you would assume, I'm going to assume that it's clear, that they were not accompanying anyone, otherwise they wouldn't have been ambushed on their own.
That seems to be what the story is, and if they had a driver who was an Arabic speaker that got out and first shouted the greeting that led to the hail of fire. And again, remember that a lot of ISIS volunteers are foreign volunteers from Europe, from North America, and the core element of them is Sunni Arabs. So if someone heard Arabic and other foreign voices, if you're a Peshmerga young recruit in the front line, you're probably going to open fire first and ask questions later if that's the case. And he would have obviously felt he was on the front line, even if our soldiers felt they were 200 meters back of it. The guy that engaged them, who is from the region, who knows the area and knows the fight, would have thought he was on the front line.
Yeah, 200 meters back. That's interesting. Parsing that again, you just mentioned it a little bit. How big is a front line in general? What's the definition of a front line?
Well, I mean, as I said, I mean, crew-served direct-fire weapons can reach out to easily to 2,000 meters. The ISIS front line is probably a good 1,500 meters away from that bunker. So, you know, where is the front line? I mean, they're not. This isn't World War I where they're about 30 yards apart in deep dug trenches. I mean, there's a fair gap there. I mean, from where they would be sitting observing the ISIS-held city or town that they were opposing on that particular moment. So.
Precisely, Jason Kenney says they were approaching a Kurdish observation post behind the forward operating line.
Correct. But it's a pretty fluid line. I mean, it's not something which, as I said, stretches like in World War I from border to border. It moves all the time.
Yeah. What was your reaction when you initially heard the Kurdish forces say it was the Canadians' fault? They didn't obey orders in that they got out of the car. What did you think when you heard that?
I think it reinforced the notion I've always held, is that the Kurds didn't really want us sending advisors to them in the first place. I mean, we pride ourselves on the fact that we've got, you know, some of the best soldiers in the world, no question about it. Our soldiers don't know that region. I mean, we've been in Afghanistan for a long time. This is not the same kettle of fish by any stretch. I mean, the different elements that are at play here, even between the different, we use the term Peshmerga. That just means someone who goes in harm's way. It's a very generic term for a soldier of Kurdish descent. I mean, so they can be anything from the Al-Qaeda Kurdish battalions, which are fighting ISIS alongside of us, the various Peshmergas, even the PKK, who are considered a terrorist organization by Turkey and by Canada. There's a whole whack of different things here which we don't really know. We're coming in there. These guys have been fighting in the region. They know the region. They've been fighting. They fought each other, then they fought Saddam, and now they're fighting ISIS. They envy us for our gear, our kit, our night vision goggles, the rockets that we've got, the rangefinders, that kind of thing. They want that. They don't really want a foreign body that doesn't know the area coming in and training them. I mean, and bringing that sort of discipline and training and structure to their force. So there's a bit of resentment from them. I'm not saying this was a green on blue deliberate, but the fact is there's a lot of confusion as far as what role the Canadians play there. We want to play a role in developing these guys, but they think they're already soldiers. They've got an element of martial pride, and of course they're proud of who they are. And then bringing in these guys who are complete outsiders that don't speak the language, and somehow we're going to teach them how to fight in their own backyard, has never really been a strong plan from day one.
I need a quick answer from you. Do you believe we should be there in that mission?
We don't even know who we're fighting for, and that's the problem. That's the big question that we got to keep asking here. We're fighting against ISIS alongside the Kurds. But in the end, who are we fighting for? A central Baghdad government? Because the Kurds, they're not fighting for that. They're fighting for Kurdistan. And we're not backing the Iraqi government that's brought in Iranian generals and the Shiite militia. We're not backing them when they're fighting in Tikrit. We're very selective about who we're fighting for, but we don't ultimately have a clear picture of what victory is going to look like.
Yeah, and we won't even start on Turkey, because that's a whole other angle to this. Scott Taylor, editor and publisher of Esprit de Corps military magazine, thank you once again for joining me from Ottawa. Appreciate it, Scott.
My pleasure.